The seconds crawled toward 2301 hours on May 8, 1945. Germany's surrender loomed. But east of the Elbe River, thousands still raced against time itself. One simple truth drove them forward: cross the line before midnight and survive. Miss that deadline and disappear forever into Soviet labor camps. What unfolded at that shattered crossing became more than just another surrender. It transformed into the most desperate survival gamble of the entire war. 4 days earlier, the twisted remains of Tangermünde Bridge creaked in the darkness. Bent steel beams reached across the Elbe like broken fingers. Below, black water swirled around chunks of concrete and twisted metal. Across this demolished span, an endless stream of people moved forward in single file. Each step was a bet on life itself. Every footfall on those unstable planks could mean the difference between freedom and death. American sentries on the western shore watched through field glasses. The sight before them defied everything they knew about warfare. This wasn't scattered retreat. This was organized desperation. Complete Wehrmacht units still marched in formation. Officers wore their decorations proudly. Behind them came women gripping children close to their bodies. Elderly men in Volkssturm armbands struggled forward. Wounded soldiers lay on improvised stretchers made from doors and blankets. All moved through the night with only one sound echoing across the water: the shuffle of boots. The quiet sobs of the exhausted, the metallic groan of the dying bridge itself. To the east, Soviet artillery thundered closer each hour. Red Army tanks ground through villages without mercy. Fighter planes swept the roads hunting German columns. Every person in that procession understood the stakes completely. Soviet capture meant almost certain doom. Starvation waited in those eastern camps. Forced labor stretched into years of misery. The endless Siberian gulags swallowed men whole. But reaching the Americans offered something entirely different. These former enemies promised food. They provided shelter. They might even offer survival itself. For 6 brutal years, the Wehrmacht had fought with legendary discipline. Now, in these final desperate days, that same army melted into a river of humanity, fleeing toward one fragile crossing. Warriors who had once conquered half of Europe now became refugees. They begged for the privilege of captivity. But what caused the most disciplined fighting force in history to collapse into such desperate flight? Why did so many risk everything to surrender specifically to American hands instead of facing Soviet justice? The answers lay in those final chaotic months of the dying Reich. Spring 1945 brought complete collapse to Germany. The nation no longer waged war. It simply disintegrated before the world's eyes. Entire cities lay buried under rubble. Railway networks had been smashed beyond repair. Factory smokestacks stood cold and silent. Across the crumbling battlefronts, the last Wehrmacht soldiers faced impossible odds. From the east, the Red Army rolled forward like an unstoppable avalanche. Marshal Zhukov commanded the 1st Belarusian Front. Marshal Konev led the 1st Ukrainian Front. Together they controlled millions of troops backed by thousands of tanks and aircraft. For every German division still capable of fighting, the Soviets fielded 20 fresh units. Each dawn brought their spearheads 30 kilometers deeper into German soil. Each sunset left refugee columns further behind enemy lines. From the west, American and British armies had already smashed across the Rhine. By late April, they reached the Elbe riverbanks. Then they stopped completely, exactly as the Yalta Conference had planned. The strategy seemed straightforward. Western allies would hold their current positions. The Soviets would deliver the final blow to Berlin. Occupation zones had already been mapped out on paper, but nobody predicted the human avalanche that decision would trigger. Not Eisenhower, not Zhukov, not even the German commanders themselves. German intelligence intercepted Soviet radio transmissions. The data painted a horrifying picture. Out of every 100 Germans captured by the Red Army, fewer than 40 could expect to live through captivity. Disease killed them in overcrowded camps. Starvation claimed them during forced marches. Summary executions eliminated the rest. Siberian labor camps became mass graves covered in snow. Meanwhile, reports from units already surrendered to Americans told completely different stories. Prisoners received regular meals. Wounded got medical treatment. Geneva Convention rules were mostly followed. Food arrived daily. Medical supplies were shared. Humane treatment wasn't guaranteed, but it was probable. To German ears, this sounded like salvation itself. The arithmetic was brutal but simple. Surrender to Soviets meant probable death. Surrender to Americans meant probable survival. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel's final assessment survived the war in captured documents. One line was underlined in red ink. Maximum German forces must reach Western Allied lines before Soviet encirclement completes. This wasn't defeatism talking. This was pure survival instinct. By April 1945, 8 million German civilians had already fled westward from East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania. They brought with them more than just hunger and terror. They carried stories. Stories about what Soviet troops had done during their advance. Mass executions in village squares. Revenge killings of entire families. Widespread sexual violence against women and girls. Complete towns burned to ash and rubble. For Wehrmacht soldiers still carrying weapons, the choice became crystal clear. The question wasn't whether to fight anymore. The question was whom to surrender to. The Wehrmacht had been Europe's most disciplined military machine. Now it began dissolving before its enemies' eyes. Entire units abandoned fortified positions without firing a shot. They destroyed their own tanks and artillery pieces. They smashed rifles and machine guns. Anything that slowed their retreat westward got left behind. They fought bitter battles against their own SS blocking detachments. These fanatics tried forcing regular troops back into hopeless combat. What emerged was a grim irony. An army that had sworn loyalty unto death now fought desperately to stay alive. The Elbe River became the dividing line between two different fates. On its western bank stood American infantry divisions, well-supplied troops supported by field kitchens and medical units. Endless supply convoys rolled up from the rear areas. On its eastern bank stretched complete chaos. 1 million German soldiers mixed with 500,000 civilians. Behind them all, the thunder of Red Army guns grew louder each hour. The stage was set for the final act. The last weeks of the Reich wouldn't be decided by battles for cities or strategic positions. They would be determined by a race toward captivity. In that desperate race, one man would make a decision that defied Hitler's direct orders and changed hundreds of thousands of lives forever. Deep within his Berlin bunker, Adolf Hitler had lost all touch with reality. Among his final delusional commands came one last impossible mission. The 12th Army, positioned west of Berlin, must turn around immediately. They must break through Soviet lines and rescue the doomed capital. The man chosen for this suicidal task was General Walter Wenck. At 44 years old, he commanded Germany's youngest army. Dynamic and resourceful, Wenck inspired fierce loyalty among his troops. But unlike Hitler, Wenck understood the truth perfectly. The war was already over. Berlin could never be saved. but German lives still could be. At his headquarters near Baelitz, Wenck gathered his senior officers around situation maps. Red arrows showed Soviet advances closing inexorably on the capital city. His voice remained calm and measured, but absolutely resolute. "The war is lost," he told them quietly. "Our duty now is not to some dead ideology. Our duty is to the living. We attack, yes, but we attack westward. We open a corridor to the Americans." With those words, everything changed. Not conquest anymore, not even defense. Pure escape. The formations under Wencks' command reflected the complete collapse of the Reich itself. Elite divisions that had once seemed invincible were now reduced to scattered fragments. The 12th Army's corps still possessed some tanks and artillery pieces. They retained experienced officers who knew their trade, but attached to them came the broken remnants of other shattered units. Stragglers from the destroyed 9th Army arrived daily. Hitler Youth Brigades consisted of boys barely 16 years old. Volkssturm battalions contained men over 60. Women auxiliaries wore faded uniforms. Construction crews had no tools left to use. Luftwaffe ground personnel served units with no aircraft remaining. This wasn't an army anymore. It had become a procession of the desperate. Yet Wenck gave them all a purpose they could understand. He carved open a narrow path through Soviet battle lines, just wide enough for thousands to slip through heading west. Behind every rearguard skirmish and delaying action came streams of soldiers and civilians, all moving toward one single objective: the Elbe River crossing. Word spread quickly through bunkers and trenches. From collapsing towns and burning villages, German troops heard the whispers. Americans treat prisoners according to international law. Soviets do not. They provide bread and clean water. They offer medical care for the wounded. What began as rumor soon hardened into absolute certainty. For those still carrying rifles, the mission became perfectly clear. Don't fight for victory anymore. Fight to surrender and survive. The result was extraordinary to witness. Entire military units, still armed and disciplined, chose to dissolve themselves into Wencks' corridor. Colonels led their complete staffs westward in parade formation. They carried regimental battle flags as if marching to an official ceremony. Naval detachments abandoned their coastal positions. They marched inland on blistered feet to reach American lines. Even SS units, notorious for their fanatical loyalty, appeared in the columns seeking the same fate as ordinary infantry. The procession swelled beyond all expectations. Carts creaked under loads of precious belongings. Mothers pushed wheelbarrows with children huddled inside. Old men leaned heavily on rifles from the previous war. Wounded soldiers were carried on doors ripped from houses. They were bandaged with torn clothing and rags. Everyone clung to life until they could cross that river. From aircraft overhead, the scene looked less like military retreat and more like mass migration. An entire nation was moving westward. They traded allegiance to ideology for a simple chance at staying alive. For Americans observing from the western riverbank, the transformation seemed completely surreal. Through binoculars, they watched the Wehrmacht, once terror of all Europe, reduced to a human flood. Not attackers approaching, not defenders resisting, just supplicants moving with grim determination toward the privilege of captivity. The journey westward had begun in earnest. This wasn't measured in victories or defeats anymore, only in kilometers covered, hours remaining. The fragile strength of desperate people trying to reach the other side. Ahead lay the deadliest gauntlet of all. The road to the Elbe ran straight through the Soviet noose that was tightening around Berlin. Every mile forward would be paid for in blood. The westward march began in complete silence. Not the silence of military discipline, but of utter exhaustion. Boot leather dragged through thick mud. Wagon wheels groaned under impossible loads. Only the occasional whimper of a frightened child, or the harsh cough of a wounded soldier, interrupted the steady rhythm of footsteps. At first glance, this resembled a typical military retreat. But this was no ordinary withdrawal. This was a biblical exodus. Tens of thousands of people funneled into Wencks' narrow corridor. Soldiers mixed with civilians and auxiliaries, all flowing westward toward the Americans. Every kilometer traveled west meant one step closer to survival. Every kilometer that remained east meant facing the Soviets. And behind them waited certain death. Daily life in the column blurred into patterns of constant hunger, bone-deep fatigue, and paralyzing fear. Military rations had vanished weeks ago. Many people chewed on raw potatoes scavenged from muddy fields. Children licked empty food tins, hoping for traces of salt or grease. Soldiers bartered ammunition for moldy bread. Boots were traded for handfuls of grain. Thirst drove some to drink from roadside ditches. Their lips cracked and blistered from dysentery. Yet still, they kept moving forward. American observation posts reported scenes that completely defied military logic. German vehicles approached with headlights blazing brightly. No attempt at concealment was made. Tanks rolled not into battle positions, but into surrender formations. Crews sat upright with white cloths fluttering from gun turrets. One reconnaissance officer radioed back in complete disbelief. Enemy forces approaching our positions are not attacking. They are displaying white surrender flags and requesting terms for capitulation. But the path westward was anything but safe to travel. SS units still roamed throughout the rear areas. Blocking detachments carried orders to shoot deserters on sight. Every road junction had armed patrols. During nighttime hours, rifle shots echoed through dark forests. These were executions of those accused of cowardice. Some refugee columns split apart completely. They scattered across fields to avoid SS checkpoints. Others paid the ultimate price in blood and terror. Entire groups were turned back at gunpoint. They were forced eastward into waiting Soviet jaws. The most horrifying passage came through the Spree Forest near Halbe. April 24, 1945. 200,000 German soldiers trapped alongside 40,000 civilians, all caught inside a tightening Soviet ring of steel. Hitler's orders still demanded they break through eastward to Berlin. But instinct and Wencks' whispered promises urged them west toward life. What followed wasn't a battle. It was systematic massacre. Artillery shells pounded forest paths into killing zones. Every tree line became a death trap. Katyusha rockets shrieked overhead, scattering razor-sharp shrapnel into columns of defenseless refugees. T-34 tanks fired point-blank into civilian convoys. They crushed both carts and human bodies beneath their tracks. Soviet aircraft swooped low over swampy clearings. They strafed hiding places where civilians tried to shelter their children. Bodies piled up at every stream crossing. Children clung to mothers who were already dead. German officers shot their own wounded soldiers rather than leave them for Soviet capture and torture. Colonel Hans von Luck survived this hell, and later wrote, "It was no longer war, as we understood it. It was pure massacre. The forest became a slaughterhouse soaked in blood." Of the 200,000 who began the Halbe breakout, barely 40,000 reached Wencks' lines alive. The rest were completely annihilated. Some were captured and marched east. Most were simply erased from existence, swallowed by fire, steel, and eternal silence. Yet even amid such horror, moments of humanity flickered like candle flames. A teenage Hitler Youth member, exhausted beyond endurance, gave up his seat on an overcrowded truck to an elderly man. Then he began walking west in bare feet. A Wehrmacht doctor refused to abandon his patients despite the approaching Soviets. He stayed with the wounded, knowing it meant captivity or worse. Families torn apart in the chaos passed children hand to hand through crowds of strangers. They trusted unknown people to carry precious lives toward hope. For those who survived the Halby massacre, the ordeal burned itself forever into memory. Every survivor became a living witness to what awaited anyone who failed to reach the Elbe. Fear crystallized into iron determination. The column pressed onward. By late April, American soldiers stationed on the western riverbank watched with growing astonishment. They saw not fleeing rabble, but organized military formations approaching in good order. Officers still saluted properly. Regimental bands carried their instruments with pride. Even SS generals appeared in full-dress uniforms. They weren't attacking American positions. They weren't offering resistance. They were surrendering deliberately and en masse with weapons still in their hands. To the Americans, this seemed completely surreal. To the Germans, it represented pure salvation. But the race against time was far from finished. Soviet forces were tightening their noose around Berlin with each passing hour. Time was running out like sand through desperate fingers. For hundreds of thousands still trapped east of the Elbe, one fragile crossing at Tangermünde represented the only bridge spanning the gap between survival and complete oblivion. By May 1, 1945, the Reich had less than 1 week left to live. Every passing hour brought Soviet forces closer to final victory. Every tick of the clock shrank the distance between life and destruction. The focal point of this desperate race became a broken skeleton of twisted steel. The Tangermünde Bridge crossing. Once it had been a proud span across the Elbe River. Weeks earlier, German engineers had blown it up trying to slow the American advance. Ironically, its twisted remains now became the only lifeline for tens of thousands of desperate people. Bent girders and fractured concrete slabs formed a precarious pathway, just wide enough for single-file passage. On this fragile causeway, the fate of entire armies and countless families balanced with each trembling step. From May 4th through May 7th, the crossing transformed into one of the strangest and most haunting theaters of the entire war. American soldiers on the western bank worked side by side with German engineers. Together they shored up the dangerous wreckage. Wooden planks were laid across gaps in the structure. Ropes anchored swaying beams that threatened to collapse. Every creak of metal threatened total failure. Every vibration could send men, women, and children plunging into the black waters below. Yet still they came in endless streams, an unbroken river of humanity flowing westward. Wehrmacht officers led their staff cars across carefully. Tank crews carried sidearms but abandoned their vehicles. Naval sailors who hadn't seen ocean in months now marched on blistered, bleeding feet. Female auxiliaries clutched identity documents, pleading desperately not to be sent back east to Soviet hands. Mothers carried infants wrapped in whatever cloth remained. Elderly people staggered forward with makeshift canes. Hospital patients were wheeled across on stretchers still stained with dried blood. American Master Sergeant James Patterson later wrote about the scene. They came in waves from dawn to dusk. Then through the night by moonlight, soldiers stacked their rifles in piles like cordwood. Women pushed children forward with desperate urgency. Old men in Volkssturm armbands shuffled across with hollow, haunted eyes. Nobody ran in panic. Nobody offered resistance. They were just grateful beyond words to reach our side of the river. For American forces, the situation was completely overwhelming. Processing one prisoner properly required 20 minutes of paperwork. Medical checks and registration took time. But by the first days of May, as many as 20,000 people arrived every single day. Colonel Benjamin Thompson, Chief of Staff for the 18th Airborne Corps, made a fateful command decision. Forget the forms for now. Get them fed first. Get them medical treatment. Paperwork can wait indefinitely. Human lives cannot wait. On the eastern approaches, German military police directed traffic with desperate efficiency. American MPs maintained order on the far bank. Both sides understood completely that if panic erupted, if the crossing became clogged with bodies, thousands would be trapped when Soviet forces finally arrived. And so former enemies saluted one another respectfully. They cooperated in tense silence. It was warfare turned completely inside out. Germans and Americans working together to keep a bridge open. Not for battle this time. For surrender and survival. Every hour brought new scenes of surreal military dignity. One colonel arrived with his complete regimental staff in full parade formation. He insisted on formally surrendering their battle flag according to proper protocol. An SS general crossed wearing an immaculate dress uniform. He requested honorable captivity for his remaining men. Some were met with cold stares from American troops. Others received weary but respectful nods. But all were accepted and taken into custody. Behind the soldiers came waves of civilians. Families pushed their remaining belongings in wheelbarrows and handcarts. Children became separated from parents in the crushing crowds. They were passed hand to hand across the ruins by strangers. Elderly people too frail to walk were lifted bodily by anyone with strength remaining. Hospital patients still in their beds were wheeled across by nurses who refused to abandon them to Soviet mercy. This wasn't an army anymore. It was a nation broken into fragments, pouring across a shattered bridge in desperate search of continued existence. But the ultimate deadline loomed larger with each passing hour. On May 7th at 02:41 hours, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Rems. The ceasefire would officially take effect at 2301 hours on May 8th. That left exactly 45 hours. 45 hours to reach American lines. 45 hours before every German remaining east of the Elbe became a Soviet prisoner forever. The final days turned into complete frenzy. German officers ordered their men to abandon all heavy equipment immediately. Tanks were blown up with demolition charges. Artillery pieces were spiked and destroyed. Military trucks were set ablaze. Anything that slowed the march westward got left behind. Documents were burned in roadside bonfires that lit up the night sky. Entire divisions dissolved into individual human beings, each man and woman making the same desperate calculation. How many hours remained? How many kilometers still to cover? American units stationed on the western bank witnessed an incredible transformation. From May 4th to May 7th, the trickle became a raging torrent. 3,000 crossed on the 4th, 7,000 on the 5th, 15,000 on the 6th. By May 7th, tens of thousands streamed across every single day. The bridge thundered continuously with the sound of boots, cartwheels, and desperate cries. Soviet forces were closing in rapidly. Artillery shells began landing within range of the crossing. On May 6th, American batteries returned fire for the first time. Not to advance their own positions, but to shield German refugees still attempting to cross. It became one of the war's strangest moments. American gunners were technically engaging Soviet positions to protect the safe passage of the very enemy they had fought for 4 long years. For those trapped in the column, tension became absolutely unbearable. Every step across the broken beams felt like racing against the clock of death itself. Men clutched their children close. Women whispered prayers to whatever gods still listened. Officers urged their men forward with hoarse voices. Not into battle this time. Into surrender and the hope of survival. General Wenck himself finally crossed on May 8th at 0200 hours. He slipped across a damaged railroad bridge less than 21 hours before the official ceasefire. Behind him, Soviet tank engines could already be heard rolling into the positions his men had abandoned just minutes before. Of his original 200,000 soldiers, barely half reached American lines alive. Yet his defiance of Hitler's suicidal orders, his choice of humanity over destructive ideology, saved an estimated 250,000 soldiers and civilians from Soviet captivity. Even in those final desperate hours, individual stories emerged that revealed both the depth of human desperation and the flickering moments of compassion. A Luftwaffe lieutenant named Klaus Hartmann flew his fighter aircraft west until fuel ran completely out. He crash-landed in an American field rather than risk capture by advancing Soviets. A U-boat commander scuttled his vessel deliberately, then led his entire crew overland to surrender to Western forces. A teenage soldier gave up his seat on an overcrowded truck to an elderly civilian. Then he walked the remaining 100 kilometers on foot, arriving just 18 hours before the ceasefire took effect. He survived the ordeal. Those who remained behind him did not. The very last person to cross was Heinrich Fischer, 63 years old, a Volkssturm volunteer. He stepped onto the western bank at 22:47 hours on May 8th, just 14 minutes before the official ceasefire. When American officers asked why he had risked everything for those final minutes, he answered with simple dignity. "I wanted to see my grandchildren again." By then, the bridge had fallen completely silent. The river beneath it reflected only drifting smoke, pale moonlight, and the echoes of 1,000,000 desperate footsteps. Those who made the crossing discovered life awaited them. Those who failed were swallowed by the eastern darkness forever. The Tangermünde crossing represented more than military evacuation. It was more than mass surrender. It became the climax of Germany's final tragedy. The moment when conquerors became refugees. The moment when an empire built on violence dissolved into masses of human beings begging for mercy. And for many of them, mercy was found not in victory, but in captivity. May 8th, 1945. The guns fell silent across Europe. At 23:01 hours, the ceasefire officially took effect. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. But along the banks of the Elbe River, the silence wasn't peace. It was exhaustion mixed with relief. It was the hollow echo of a nation dissolved into captivity. In just 3 weeks, American forces had processed over 1.5 million German prisoners. The 102nd Infantry Division alone accepted the surrender of more than 300,000 men. More soldiers than the entire German army that had invaded Poland in September 1939. By June, the numbers would swell to nearly 4 million under Western Allied control. This wasn't conquest achieved through combat. This was capitulation by desperate choice. The scenes inside the Rheinwiesenlager, the temporary Rhine meadow camps, captured both the chaos and the unexpected mercy of this vast surrender. Barbed wire, enclosed open fields stretching to the horizon. Prisoners dug holes into the earth for shelter from rain and wind. Spring weather turned the ground into thick mud. Food consisted of basic rations: black bread and watery soup, a handful of beans when available. Water came from rivers, pumped into makeshift wooden troughs. Sanitation remained primitive at best. Disease spread quickly through the crowded camps. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis claimed victims daily. Yet remarkably, the overall death rate remained below 1%. Conditions were harsh, yes. Overcrowded, certainly. But survivable for those who reached American hands. For men who had expected Soviet captivity, this wasn't hell on earth. This was deliverance. American medics worked around the clock without rest. 30% of arriving prisoners required immediate medical treatment. Malnutrition was universal among them. Infected wounds had festered for weeks without proper care. Children staggered from prolonged hunger. Women collapsed from complete exhaustion. Captain David Miller, a medical officer, performed surgeries for 72 hours straight without stopping. These weren't fresh combat wounds, he recalled years later. They were weeks old and completely untreated. Gangrene had set in. Men walked on broken bones that had never been set. Shrapnel remained embedded in flesh. Women bore injuries from sexual assault. Children were so weak they couldn't stand upright. The Red Ball Express, once used to fuel Patton's drive across France, now ran convoys loaded with bread and medical supplies to feed former enemies. C-47 transport planes dropped parachutes laden with food over the camps. Field kitchens designed to feed 15,000 suddenly carried the burden of 60,000 hungry mouths. The strain on American logistics was immense beyond calculation. Yet somehow, the system held together. The moral dilemmas proved even heavier than logistical challenges. The Yalta Agreement had demanded that German forces surrender equally to all Allied powers. Accepting mass capitulation to Americans alone risked serious diplomatic fracture with the Soviets. But turning desperate men, women, and children back east was simply unthinkable. General Omar Bradley later admitted the truth. "We knew exactly what we were doing. We were accepting surrenders we technically shouldn't have under the agreements. But we also knew what Soviet captivity meant for these people. Sometimes, basic humanity must trump diplomatic protocol." The consequences of that decision created ripple effects that lasted for decades. Families were torn apart in the chaos of mass processing. Fathers became separated from sons in the confusion. Brothers were lost among different wire enclosures. Some families never reunited again. Accurate casualty counts became impossible to maintain. In the massive confusion, war criminals may have slipped through undetected. They disappeared into the tide of desperate humanity. But for the vast majority, surrender to Americans meant continued life. Prisoners were not executed out of hand. They were not deliberately starved to death. They were not forced to march until they died in the snow. For men who had been told Americans were ruthless barbarians, the reality proved completely disorienting. A piece of bread, a bowl of soup, an occasional cigarette. To soldiers who had seen nothing but brutality for months, it was enough to break them into tears. Private Hans Bauer, just 17 years old, remembered the moment decades later. "I had been told Americans were torturers who showed no mercy. Instead, they gave me chocolate. I hadn't seen chocolate in 3 years. A medic cleaned and bandaged my infected wound. An officer asked if I could write a letter to my mother. They treated me not as a hated enemy, but as a boy who had been forced to fight. By contrast, Those who failed to cross the Elbe River in time faced a completely different fate. NKVD archives released after the Cold War revealed the true scale of German losses in Soviet captivity. 3 million were taken prisoner. More than 1 million died in camps, mines, and forced labor details. Many others simply disappeared without any trace. Their names were erased from all records. For them, the war didn't end in May 1945. It dragged on for years in the gulags of the frozen East. Thus, the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender wasn't defined solely by military defeat. It was defined by stark contrast. The contrast between survival in the West and annihilation in the East. The contrast between revenge and mercy. The contrast between death and life. It left behind a question that echoed for decades throughout the Cold War. Had the Americans saved their former enemies from justified punishment? Or had they prevented the Soviets from achieving rightful justice? The war had ended at last, but the memory of those Elbe River crossings never faded from history. For those who crossed at Tangermünde, the broken bridge became more than twisted steel and shattered concrete. It became the threshold between death and survival, between vengeance and mercy, between the past and the future. General Walter Wenck lived until 1982. In interviews during his later years, he never expressed any regret for defying Hitler's final suicidal orders. "I chose not to sacrifice my men for a dead ideology," he stated simply. "Every soldier and every civilian we managed to get across that river was a victory. Not a victory of arms and conquest, but a victory of basic humanity over destructive madness." To the survivors he rescued, Wenck was remembered as Der Retter, the savior, the general who chose life over death when the choice still mattered. For Germans who reached American custody, survival itself became their lasting legacy. 96% eventually returned home to rebuild their lives. They became fathers and grandfathers. They formed the silent foundation of post-war West Germany. They carried forward the memory of American mercy. For those trapped in the Soviet occupation zone, the story ended much darker. Families remained divided for generations. Communities were shattered beyond repair. Entire generations were scarred by enforced silence, by names that could never again be spoken aloud. Historians continue debating the Western Allies' decision to this day. Was it a breach of Yalta that undermined the unity of victory? Or was it the only humane response to a human catastrophe unfolding in real time? General Omar Bradley offered the simplest answer that still resonates. Sometimes basic humanity must trump diplomatic protocol. The consequences rippled forward into the Cold War that followed. The memory of American mercy gradually softened German hearts toward their former enemies. When the Federal Republic joined NATO in 1955, it wasn't only Cold War geopolitics at work. It was also living memory. The memory of bread instead of bullets, of shelter instead of execution, of a bridge that led not to prison camps in the East, but to survival in the West. The irony was stark and unmistakable. The Wehrmacht, which had once conquered half of Europe in pursuit of racial empire, ended the war as refugees begging for captivity. The 1,000-year Reich collapsed completely in just 12 brutal years. Its final chapter was written not in triumph and conquest, but in surrender and desperate flight. And yet this story carries a lesson deeper than military defeat. It demonstrates that even in the darkest hours of total war, the choice between vengeance and mercy still mattered profoundly. For Americans stationed along the Elbe, it wasn't military victory that ultimately defined their character. It was restraint under pressure. It was discipline in the face of hatred. It was fundamental humanity when humanity seemed lost forever. The Tangermünde Bridge was never rebuilt after the war. Its ruins eventually disappeared beneath the flowing waters, but its memory endures as a monument, not to conquest and destruction, but to compassion in the midst of total war. Proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, the truest measure of victory lies not in enemies destroyed, but in human lives saved.